Well, 20 years later, we're still doing commercial transactions in Canada, and we do them with very few serious legal impediments. How did we get there? Well, when the tax administration introduced the GAR, and the Parliament introduced the GAR, they listened to the message that was being sent from the tax community. And as you can see, there were actions taken to ensure that there was certainty and clarity as to what the GAR would apply to. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but there were rulings, there were independent publications, there's a government website which has constant postings, and initially there were information circulars actually setting out specifics of transactions which would run afoul of the GAR and those that would not. What did the government do from the perspective of consistency? Canada is a big country, and there was a need for consistency not only in our income tax law but also in our VAT law in applying the GAR principles. So the government created a GAR committee. And that committee is a non-statutory advisory body that is made up of our tax administration, our finance representatives, and the Department of Justice. And all primary assessments under the GAR must be reviewed by and approved by the GAR committee. Advanced income tax rulings may also be referred to the GAR committee for its opinion. And what has happened is that over the last 20 years, the GAR committee has met on a bi-weekly basis, has administered the GAR on a uniform basis nationally, and it has worked extremely well. People do know what the government is concerned about, and they do know where the major contentious cases are focusing. Now, one other question I noticed yesterday in the discussion went to penalties. When the GAR was first proposed, it was suggested that there be a financial penalty imposed in addition to tax and interest, but the statute eventually, when it was enacted, did not contain that provision. The Tax Court of Canada recently held that penalties cannot arise in a GAR transaction where there has been a recharacterization. Why not? Well, first of all, GAR is not a penalty provision. And secondly, taxpayers may not self-assess themselves under the GAR, so their failure to do so should not engender a penalty. But, as in all creative matters, our government once again has looked at how it might become more creative and has introduced in September of this year draft reporting rules which will require those involved in aggressive tax planning to report the transaction, and failure to report the transaction will result in not percentage penalties, but penalties which are the equivalent of all fees that are charged and paid, contingent or otherwise, in respect of the transaction. I'm going to skip over the treaty context, and then I'm just going to take a moment to make some final observations on the Canadian experience in GAR. First of all, as I said, when GAR was introduced, the issue was uncertainty, and the government suggested that uncertainty is an inevitable yet temporary byproduct of the introduction of any new law. I think that the government has done everything it can to clarify the application and the interpretation that it gives to our general anti-avoidance rule. GAR, in the Canadian experience, will not serve and cannot serve as a stopgap to legislation. Where there are loopholes in the Act, GAR cannot be used to fill those gaps. However, it has proved to be an effective deterrent to aggressive taxpayer planning in situations where the government has clearly established the tax policy behind its intentions. The GAR is a flexible tool as attitudes both in society and in tax administrations change. Our GAR has been able to react to those modifications and to accommodate them. GAR is inherently a factual exercise and susceptible of unpredictability even after over 20 years. And it has not been used by our government except as a last resort, and as such, it has not introduced uncertainty into commercial transactions. What has it done? It has been very effective in reducing tax litigation for a number of reasons. I'm not going to go through all of them, but 2 or 3 warrant comment. First, the requirement that the GAR committee review primary GAR assessments. Second, the improvement of the screening process of the government due to better internal tax administration standards. Third, the actual decline in referrals from the tax administration to the GAR committee, and the consequential increase in the cumulative rate of affirmative decisions. Now, before last week, I would have also said that the tax court decisions and the other court decisions in Canada tend to favor the Crown since 2005, but as a result of 2 or 3 decisions that have occurred in the last 3 weeks, I'm not sure I can say that, but there certainly is a more balanced position. There's another very, very important thing. The tax court and all of the other courts are subject to the human factor. And that means that the judges have their own personal opinions, and those influence the growth in the doctrine. And so one of the things that's happening is that there is if you will, a lack of enthusiasm on the part of taxpayers and tax advisors to litigate if there is a settlement possible. And the last thing is the new cases that are coming out of the court. They show the importance of pleadings in the GAR cases and of competent counsel on both sides. Because if you don't plead the case well, then the court can't decide it in your favor. And that has been illustrated time and time again over the past few years. I'd like to thank you, muito obrigado, for taking the time to spend with me, and it has been my pleasure to speak to you today.